Lennon is one of the most complex individuals ever to walk the face of the earth. The British-born musician is a true international icon who influenced the world with his message of peace and love. In America, Lennon is one of the most loved people ever to call the United States home. Lennon was one of the founding members of the international supergroup The Beatles. He, along with Paul McCartney, formed the early creative brain trust of a group that changed music worldwide. The group's success has never been duplicated, and its music is as popular today as it was in the 1960s and 70s. Lennon wrote or co-wrote some of the most memorable tunes ever written in the rock and roll genre. He found great success as a member of the Beatles, which is the most commercially successful group in history, and as a solo artist. Lennon was also a political activist. His views on religion and politics caused a great deal of controversy in the United States. He was an outspoken critic of the country's involvement in the Vietnam conflict. His popularity caused great concern with government officials because he had the attention of the young people in America at the time. Lennon had been living in New York for several years, where he was being watched by the FBI in order to find grounds to deport him from the United States. He used flamboyant gimmicks to spread his word of peace. In this passive protest, Lennon and his wife Ono addressed the media from their beds, claiming people should make love, not war. Lennon was killed on December 8, 1980, by a crazy gunman outside his home in New York City. A memorial plaque at the site of his death is one of the most visited sites in the country. Aircraft hijacking, or skyjacking, is the international taking of an airplane usually done for political purposes. Unlike ground vehicle hijacking, which is done for financial gain, for the most part, skyjacking is a darker, more dangerous, potentially life-threatening action. During the mid-1960s to the 1970s, about 160 aircraft were skyjacked worldwide. In the United States, many had taken control of aircraft, but no one had ever escaped the reach of law enforcement, with one glaring exception of D.B. Cooper. D.B. Cooper's real name is Dan Cooper, but his legend began as D.B. Cooper because of a mistake by the media in 1971. On November 24th, Cooper hijacked a Boeing 727 jetliner after purchasing a one-way ticket from Portland to Seattle, Washington. Cooper demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes to be delivered upon arrival to Seattle. Authorities complied with his ransom request, and Cooper let all 36 passengers and most of the crew off of the plane at the time. Once back in the air, Cooper directed the pilot to fly to Mexico, but the jet's fuel was not enough to make it there without stopping to refuel. It was decided to land in Reno, Nevada for refueling. When the aircraft reached Reno, Cooper was not on board. It is thought that Cooper jumped out of the aircraft somewhere in the wooded forests of Oregon. He had ordered the plane to fly at the lowest possible speed and to fly at only 10,000-foot elevation. The legend of D.B. Cooper was born. To this date, the Cooper skyjacking is the only case that is unresolved in the United States. Cooper was never found, nor was any evidence of the $200,000 and his parachute. Many believe Cooper could not survive a drop from such great altitude, while others say the absence of any money or the evidence of his death proves he survived. In any event, D.B. Cooper is a true American legend. No name evokes more controversy in the United States than O.J. Simpson. He has been in the American spotlight for decades, ever since he was a star football player at the University of Southern California, a premier academic university which is primarily known for its full, rich football tradition. USC is one of the greatest places for future pro football players to get their start. Simpson knew this when he transferred to the school in the mid-1960s from San Francisco Community College. At USC, Simpson found fame. His fortune was to come later. He helped the university reach the coveted Rose Bowl berth in 1968, following an outstanding 1967 season where he led the nation in rushing yards. His 64-yard run against arch-rival UCLA in what many people say was the greatest game in college football history is what legends are made of. Simpson later played in the National Football League, where he gained more fame and fortune. Upon retirement, he turned to an acting career where he starred in many commercials and eventually movies. Unfortunately, Simpson's life took a tragic turn in later years. He was accused of murdering his wife and her friend in the early 90s. His trial was one of the most watched events in the history of television. Simpson was acquitted of the murder, due largely to his dream team of the high-priced attorneys. Many people believe that Simpson committed the murder and got away with it. Simpson was later convicted in a Nevada court for several offenses and is currently serving time in prison. Many believe this conviction was retribution for his earlier crimes. It was not so long ago that women in the United States were treated like second-class citizens. They did not have the same basic rights as their male counterparts had. At one time, women were not allowed to vote, own property, or get education. Since those dark times, the women of America have made great strides in their struggle for equality. One of their heroes was the great Billie Jean King. King was a professional tennis player who gained great success during her career on the women's tennis court. She won 39 Grand Slam titles, 12 singles, 16 women's doubles, and 11 mixed doubles. She found success in just about every avenue she participated in, including the Federation Cup Championships. King's greatest accomplishment, however, was an exhibition match that took place in Houston, Texas on September 20, 1973. The 29-year-old King, who was at the top of her professional career at the time, faced a former Wimbledon champion, Bobby Riggs. Riggs was one of the best men's players during his prime in the late 1930s and 40s. The 55-year-old Riggs challenged King to an exhibition match, claiming that the women's game was far inferior to the men's game. He said that even a 55-year-old washed-up former player could beat the top woman in the world. The stage was set for a match. However, it was not much of a match at all. King soundly defeated Riggs without much trouble. The match was later exposed for what many people claimed it would be, a showcase for King to demonstrate that women could compete against men. The victory was part of the equal rights movement that was sweeping the nation during the time. King became an outspoken advocate of equal rights for women. Madonna Louise Ciccone is a popular singer, songwriter, and actress in the United States. Madonna, as she is commonly known, burst onto the music scene in the early 1980s with a style that had never been seen before. Her sexy and scantily clad costumes and performances both delighted and aggravated the American public for years. She excelled at pushing the boundaries of what most Americans perceived as acceptable in their music videos and live performances. Madonna did not shy away from controversial subjects either. Madonna was born in Bay City, Michigan in 1958. She moved to New York City to pursue a career in dancing as a young woman. She began her career with a couple of club bands in New York, but was soon noticed by music industry executives. In 1983, she released her first album, titled simply Madonna. This was just the beginning for the superstar. She followed her initial success with several hit albums and singles such as Like a Virgin and Into the Groove. She coupled her commercial success in music with successful performances in a series of movies such as Desperately Seeking Susan and Evita. It seemed there was nothing Madonna could not do. One of Madonna's defining characteristics is her ability to reinvent herself. Many artists find success in the very competitive and entertainment industry, but most are only successful for a short period of time. But not Madonna. She has sold more than 300 million records worldwide to date. She ranks second only to the Beatles on Billboard's charts of greatest acts of the 20th century. Madonna's career has not been without controversy, though. She has been the subject of several lawsuits for her acts, but she survived and thrived through it all. She is still one of the best female artists in the United States today. The United States of America is the only country ever to land a manned spacecraft on the surface of the moon. The first person to walk on the moon was Neil Armstrong. Armstrong set foot on the surface of the moon on July 20th, 1969, in what was one of the most watched telecasts in the history of the country. Armstrong became an instant celebrity whose name became a household word for generations to come. The lunar landing mission was carried out on the Apollo 11 spacecraft. Armstrong was the mission commander for the historic flight and was the second and last mission flown by him. There were complications involving the landing module that Armstrong dealt with at the time of the landing. The module was coming in faster than planned. It was destined to miss the landing site by several miles, but some quick thinking by Armstrong prevented a potential disaster. When Armstrong did step on the lunar surface, his words echoed throughout the country and the world. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Years later, Armstrong and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, insisted that the quote was incorrect and was obscured by interference. However, the quote is remembered forever in its original form. Armstrong received the Congressional Medal of Freedom from President Richard Nixon and was later awarded the Congressional Space Medal of Honor by President Jimmy Carter. The program was discontinued in the early 70s. Other countries have landed unmanned missions to the Earth's largest satellite, but to date, no other person has walked on the moon since then. Neil Armstrong, a true American hero, died in 2012 following complications from a surgical procedure. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, best known as Mark Twain, is an American author and humorist. He wrote two of the most significant novels, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. He grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, which provided the settings for his novels. Clemens held a variety of odd jobs as a young man. He was a journalist, miner, printer's apprentice, and typesetter, but journalism was what he liked doing best. His writing style earned him praise from critics worldwide. William Faulkner, another great American author, called him the father of American literature. Twain was already a very successful writer when he wrote The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. The main character, Tom Sawyer, was based on his own experiences as a child. His best friends were also based on real-life friends Twain grew up with. Huckleberry Finn, the main character of his finest work, was also based on a childhood friend. Twain was a prolific writer who penned several books and other publications. Most of his writing was taken from his life in the western part of the United States, while traveling with his brother Orion. He was born Christian, but later in life questioned his faith and developed negative feelings towards organized religion. He was once quoted as saying, "If Christ were here now, there is one thing that he would not be: Christian." Twain died in 1910 from a heart attack at the age of 74. Look, up in the sky! It's a bird. It's a plane. No, it's Superman. This is one of the most iconic lines in television history. It signaled the beginning of a new episode of The Adventures of Superman. The 1960s show is just one in a series of shows, plays, movies, and comic books that depict the Man of Steel. The most iconic character portraying Superman was Christopher Reeve. Reeve starred in 4 movies during the late 1970s and 1980s. In the 1978 movie classic Superman, Reeve was cast as the legendary American hero, based largely on his physical attributes. Although he was an accomplished actor, Reeve had the classic Superman look. He was 6 foot 4 inches tall weighed 215 pounds, with a square jaw and other manly features that made him perfect for the role. The film won critical acclaim and multiple awards, including a Special Achievement Award for visual effects. One of the selling points for the movie was that the special effects were so good that the audience would believe that a man can fly after seeing this film. Reeve went on to star in 3 sequels to the original movie, and had a very solid acting career in several movies after that. Tragically, Reeve and his family were hit with a devastating blow on May 27, 1995. Reeve was riding his horse through a steeplechase course, jumping over obstacles. His horse suddenly stopped, throwing Reeve to the ground. Reeve suffered shattered vertebrae and instantly lost the use of his arms and legs. Reeve refused to give up. He spent the rest of his years advocating for spinal cord injury advancement in treatment and technology. He used his celebrity status to help the cause, but sadly, Reeve died at the age of 52 in 2004 due to complications from his injuries. He will always be remembered to his fans as the Man of Steel, though. Richard Milhous Nixon was the 37th President of the United States, and the only one to resign from office in the history of the country. Born on January 9, 1913 in Yorba Linda, California, Nixon was a Republican Party member who served as vice president under President Dwight David Eisenhower in the 1950s. Nixon ran for president for the first time in 1960, losing to the very charismatic and young Democrat John F. Kennedy. The 1960 election was one of the closest elections in history. Kennedy went on to become one of the most popular presidents ever. Despite his loss to Kennedy in 1960, Nixon bounced back in the 1968 election when he defeated Democrat Hubert Humphrey in a landslide victory. The country was in turmoil during the 60s. The conflict in Vietnam was raging. The country was reeling from the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and his brother, Senator Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, Jr. Nixon's victory indicated the country was ready for a conservative leadership during these tough times. Nixon won the 1972 election over Democrat George McGovern in another landslide victory, which seemed to establish Nixon's legacy as a great president. Among his accomplishments was to open trade with China and promise to end the conflict in Vietnam. However, Nixon would end up resigning from office just a year after his victory. It was discovered that the Republican Party, with Nixon's knowledge, had secretly recorded the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., during the weeks leading up to the election. Nixon tried to cover up the scandal, but the pressure was too great. Nixon was forced to resign in disgrace rather than be impeached from office, which means to be removed from office by the U.S. Congress. He became the first president ever to quit while serving in office. "Go ahead, make my day," is one of the most famous cinema lines ever spoken in the history of Hollywood. The actor was Clint Eastwood, and the film was 1983's Sudden Impact. Eastwood's words became an instant catchphrase that many Americans can recite to this day. Eastwood is quite possibly the epitome of the macho American man. He holds icon-like status among males for portraying the tough guy in nearly all his films. Eastwood was born in 1930 in San Francisco before coming to Los Angeles at an early age. He briefly attended Los Angeles City College, but soon dropped out to pursue an acting career. After appearing in a couple of low-budget films, Eastwood got his big break in the old TV western Rawhide. His character Rowdy Yates was an instant celebrity, and it launched Eastwood's incredible career. Eastwood first burst onto the big screen with his roles in 3 Western movies in the 1960s. The so-called spaghetti westerns, which were called that because of their ties to Italian cinema, were all very successful and made Eastwood a household name. Eastwood followed his success with a string of movies that is unparalleled in Hollywood history. He starred in the very popular Dirty Harry franchise, where he, once again, played the tough guy. In this series, Dirty Harry is a San Francisco police officer who takes matters into his own hands. This troubles his superiors to no end, but Harry always wins. This persona delighted the American movie audiences, especially the men. Acting was not the only talent that Eastwood would eventually display. He became an Oscar-winning director also. Arguably, his best film as a director was $1 Million Baby, but it is hard to pick one film from his impressive list of movies. He is still active in film at the age of 74. There is perhaps no other director in the American film industry that is more controversial than Michael Moore. Moore's specialty is exposure. He loves to expose social issues. He is a political activist and a social critic. His films have a way of eliciting strong emotional responses. Moore was born in Flint, Michigan in 1954. His father was an assembly line worker at the General Motors, an automobile manufacturing plant. His mother was a secretary. He attended the University of Michigan, Flint campus, where he dropped out after his first year. He found work as a journalist with a couple of different local publications, but was fired from one of his jobs because of a controversy. Moore wanted to run a story about American involvement in Nicaragua, but his editors refused, which led to his dismissal. He was awarded $58,000 in an out-of-court settlement after he sued his employers. Moore used the money to start making documentaries. His first was Roger and Me, which was a piece designed to expose GM's closure of the Flint plant and its decision to open a plant in Mexico, where the wages were much lower. His film exposes the greed of corporations like GM, cutting off the lifeline of many American workers so that GM could make more profit. GM had reported record profits before the closure, which irritated Moore greatly. He followed this film with a string of documentaries that touched on many of the social and political problems Americans face daily. His film Fahrenheit 9/11 probes the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the United States in 2001. He is not kind to the George W. Bush administration for their lack of response to the attacks, and to the Bush family's alleged ties to Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of the attack. Being controversial is a right every American has, and William Bill Maher uses this right about as well as any other person in the country. Maher is an actor, comedian, political satirist, and talk show host. He was born in New York City in 1958 to a Roman Catholic family, but today he calls himself an agnostic. One of the first instances when Maher questioned Catholicism was when his father stopped taking him and his sister when he was 13. He discovered that his father was angry at the church because of their stance against birth control. His father has become an outspoken person against all organized religions ever since. Maher is currently the host of an HBO show, Real Time with Bill Maher. It is a highly rated late-night show that has received many Emmy nominations for excellence. It is a controversial show where emotions run high between Maher and his guests. Maher speaks his mind, and this has been a source of trouble over the years, but it has also earned him praise. In 2001, Maher came under criticism for his comments about the terrorist attacks on the United States in September of that year. President George W. Bush had publicly called the attackers cowards, to which Maher took exception. Maher stated on his show that the real cowards were the Americans. "We have been the cowards," said Maher. "Lobbing cruise missiles from 2,000 miles away, that's cowardly." He later said, He later said that he was not criticizing the American military, but only pointing out that America plays a large role in Middle East politics. Maher has also made enemies among religious organizations. He says he dislikes religion, which he calls an unnecessary bureaucracy between people and God. He was once very liberal about every religion, but has changed his views on Islam, saying that he knows of no other religion that calls for the death of anyone who criticizes their religion. He has also called the Mormon Church ridiculous. During the 1970s, one of the biggest movements occurring in the United States was the fight for equal rights. Many members of American society felt disenfranchised and discriminated against, especially in the workplace. Some American workers enjoyed living a wage complete with benefits and other advantages, while others struggled to earn enough to survive. One of the most oppressed groups of workers during this time period was California farm workers. The farm workers were migrant workers who came into the country mostly without documentation to work in the fertile fields of California's Great Central Valley. This region in Central California has often been described as the country's fruit basket because of its rich soil and high yields. Farm workers tended these fields during the day and lived and slept on the farm at night. They earned less than the state's minimum wage and had no fringe benefits other American workers enjoyed. Cesar Chavez changed all that. Cesar Chavez, the Arizona-born civil rights activist and labor leader, became the voice of these workers, and began a movement to bring basic rights to this group. Taking the lead from the great Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., Chavez began a series of nonviolent demonstrations protesting the deplorable conditions farm workers had to endure. Many of these workers worked much longer than 8 hours a day, and received no overtime pay. Chavez, who was a farm worker himself in the 50s, led marches and called for boycotts. These activities were very effective in changing the working conditions for farm workers and other oppressed workers. Chavez was highly recognized during his lifetime, and his legacy increased after his death in 1993. He has reached iconic status among the Mexican-American community. Hugh Hefner is one of the most controversial public figures in the United States. He is the founder and president of Playboy magazine, which is a men's adult magazine. From humble beginnings in the 1950s, Hefner has grown his pornographic industry into the multi-million-dollar enterprise, which includes his magazine publication, TV, and internet media. Born in Chicago, Illinois in 1926, Hefner led an average life growing up in the big city. He graduated from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and majored in psychology. After serving 2 years in the United States military, he began working as a copy editor at Esquire magazine in the early 50s. Hefner quit his job to go out on his own. He was determined to start a magazine that was similar to Esquire, a men's magazine. His first Playboy was published from his home in 1953, without a publication date. He did this because he was uncertain if there would be a second edition. Hefner had purchased a nude picture of the famous actress Marilyn Monroe and used that image as the centerfold of his first issue. The 50,000 copies sold quickly, and Hefner became an instant success story. During the 60s, Hefner and Playboy were at the top of their popularity. His circulation was now in the millions, and Hefner ventured into new areas for his company. He produced films, started modeling agencies, built hotels and resorts, and hosted 2 television series. His publication was not without controversy, though. In 1963, he was arrested and stood trial for publishing a photo of American actress Jane Mansfield. The charges were eventually dropped, but it was clear that there would be challenges to his publication because of its content. Hefner permanently moved his headquarters to Los Angeles in 1975 so that he could be closer to the film industry. He has been married 3 times and has 4 children. One of the most well-respected actors in Hollywood today is Tom Hanks. He is one of the most popular actors among American film and television viewers. He has gained great success as a film actor, having starred in some of the greatest movies of his generation. He starred in films such as Splash, Forrest Gump, Philadelphia, Apollo 13, Castaway, The Green Mile, Saving Private Ryan, and Big. Born in Concord, California in 1956, Hanks began his career in television in the popular TV show Bosom Buddies, where he plays a man living in a woman's dormitory. In order to live among the women, he and his roommate must dress in women's clothing during the evening hours after arriving from work. This series ran for 3 years and made Hanks a legitimate star. Hanks reached film stardom in Splash, which was a very popular love story involving Hanks as a frustrated bachelor and a mermaid. The movie launched his film career and featured Hanks in mostly comedic roles. Hanks would probably always be known as a comedic actor if he did not star in his share of dramatic roles. He played a former baseball star in A League of Their Own and a romantic lead in the popular Sleepless in Seattle. In 1993, Hanks won an Academy Award for his portrayal as a displaced worker who gets fired from his job because he has contracted AIDS in the film Philadelphia. He lost 35 pounds for his role as the gay lawyer because he wanted to look sickly. Hanks followed his Oscar-winning performance in Philadelphia with a second Academy Award for Best Actor for his role in Forrest Gump. He became only the second actor to win the award in consecutive years. Tom Hanks has used his celebrity status to address several causes such as same-sex marriage, environmental issues, and the development of alternative fuels. Johnny Carson served as host for the iconic late-night television series The Tonight Show for 30 years. During that time, Carson entertained generations of American television viewers with his down-to-earth style, casual approach, and quick-witted humor. The Tonight Show was already a big success when Carson took over from the retiring Jack Paar, but Carson took the show to the next level. His style and grace on camera has been mimicked by many late-night talk show hosts, who have credited Carson as their mentor. Carson was born thousands of miles away from the glitz of New York City and Los Angeles in the city of Corning, Iowa, in 1925. Carson began his entertainment career at the age of 14 when he appeared at county fairs as a magician, which was his first love. His family moved to the state of Nebraska when Carson was a young man, and he served as a communications officer for the U.S. Navy during the tail end of World War II. His broadcast career began in 1950 in Omaha, Nebraska, before moving to Los Angeles and landing a job with a local television station. Carson officially became the host of The Tonight Show on October 1, 1962. The show was based in New York City until 1972, when, at Carson's request, the show was permanently moved to the Los Angeles area. Carson hosted his show in Burbank for the next 21 years, where he perfected his style and approach to his guests. It was considered an honor to be invited to The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. Carson was a true entertainer. He performed many skits during his reign, where he dressed up in costume and played ridiculous characters, which is something today's late-night hosts do not do. Carson was never afraid to laugh at himself. Helen Keller was an American educator and journalist who became one of the leading humanitarians in the history of the United States. Born on June 27, 1880, in Tuscumbia, a small town in Alabama, Keller was stricken with a childhood disease that left her deaf and blind. The illness Keller suffered is a mystery to this day. She was diagnosed with brain fever by her family doctor, but most people speculate that she suffered from either scarlet fever or meningitis. Unable to see or hear, Keller became difficult to deal with as her behavior was described by her family and friends as wild. Soon Keller and her family developed their own type of sign language that allowed them to communicate on a limited basis. Helen's mother sought help for her anguished child, which eventually led to Anne Sullivan, who was a recent graduate of the Perkins Institute for the Blind. The school had been successful in the past in educating blind students, and Sullivan was one of its star graduates. Once Sullivan and Keller got through the difficult beginnings, their friendship and association lasted for 49 years. Keller was determined to become educated and to teach herself to communicate. After attending several schools, she became the first deaf and blind person to earn a college degree. She became very well known and began a lecture tour where she addressed social and political issues, including women's suffrage and birth control. In 1920, she helped found the American Civil Liberties Union, which is still active today. She addressed Congress to raise awareness to the plight of the blind. Through all her accomplishments, she fell into disfavor with the American public because of her socialist views later in life. She died in her sleep just days before her 88th birthday, but she lives in the American consciousness for her tireless work and perseverance. Born in the small town of Tupelo, Mississippi, Elvis Aaron Presley grew up in poverty. His working-class parents moved frequently throughout the state, going from job to job. Presley grew up to be one of the most recognizable and famous American celebrities the country has ever known. He recorded countless records, starred on the big screen, and his songs were heard on the radio by more fans than any other artists in history. Presley received his first guitar at the age of 10, and soon began a musical career that would last more than 25 years. His first success was winning a high school talent contest in Memphis, Tennessee, while still in school. Shortly after graduation, Presley was discovered by Sam Phillips, a record company owner. His first commercial success came in 1954 with his hit single, "That's All Right." Much of Presley's success could be attributed to his unconventional dance and live performance style. His hip movements and sexually suggestive moves earned Presley much praise and controversy. In 1956, Presley recorded his first #1 hit, Heartbreak Hotel, and his first #1 album, the self-titled Elvis Presley. He also signed a contract with Paramount Pictures Studios, which was and is still one of the biggest Hollywood studios in the industry. He went on to star in several movies with Paramount in 1957. Presley was drafted into the service by the United States Army, where he served overseas. His time in the military did not hurt his career. Soon after his service was over in 1960, Presley began recording music and starring in films. Presley married in 1967 and had a daughter the following year. Sadly, his marriage ended in divorce in 1973. He fell into prescription drug use and put on a great deal of weight. He died in August 1977, resulting from complications of his drug abuse. He still remains one of the most profitable artists in the world today. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in Talbot County, Maryland, in 1818. His exact birth date was lost to history. Many African slaves did not have their birth dates recorded into official records during that time period because they did not have basic human rights. They were considered property owned by their white masters. It was a dark time in the country. Frederick Douglass helped change that. It was illegal in the southern states to educate blacks at the time, but Douglass was fortunate enough to have been educated by the wife of his master, who began teaching Douglass the alphabet when he was 12 years old. He continued his education on his own after that. With his new reading skills, Douglass began teaching other black slaves the New Testament. He had a sympathetic owner, who did not see any harm in this activity. But his neighbors did not see eye to eye with him. It wasn't long before the lessons ended, after violent measures were taken by the white community members. Douglass eventually escaped slavery and settled in the state of Massachusetts, where he began his struggle to end slavery. Douglass became one of the most influential people of his generation. He made powerful friends in the U.S. government. During one of his lecture tours in 1843, Douglass was nearly beaten to death by an angry mob who did not agree with his message of abolition. He fled the country on a couple of occasions to avoid being put into a state of slavery again. While in Europe, Douglass spoke to the enthusiastic crowds on the evils of slavery. Audie Murphy is the most decorated American war hero in the history of the United States military. He was honored with every award available during his years in the Army during World War II. He also won awards for heroism from 2 foreign governments, Belgium and France. His military record is impressive, as he fought successfully in some of the most dangerous and historic battles during the Great War. Murphy also found success after the war as an actor who appeared in several films. Murphy was born into a large family in Hunt, Texas. He was one of 12 children and grew up in abject poverty. His father deserted his family, his mother died at a young age, so Murphy dropped out of school to get work. Murphy held a series of odd jobs from an early age to help the family financially, but eventually realized that a military life was the best course to take. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Murphy knew he needed to be in the military to defend his country, but he was not yet old enough to enlist legally. With the help of one of his older sisters, who helped provide him with false records, Murphy enlisted into the Army at age 17. It wasn't long before Murphy began making his name in the military. He first saw action in the invasion of Sicily and was involved in the liberation of Rome. He became famous for leading his men into battle while he was wounded and out of ammunition. He won several awards for valor. After the war, he launched a successful Hollywood career. His most notable film was playing himself in the epic movie classic From Here to Eternity, which was based on his autobiography. Murphy starred in several Western-themed films. He died at the age of 46 in a plane crash in the state of Virginia. During the early part of the 20th century, polio was considered one of the greatest health threats in the United States of America. Polio was a vicious disease that took its victims' lives, or left them with major disabilities. In 1952, the U.S. suffered one of its harshest epidemics of polio in its history. More than 58,000 cases of polio were reported that year, and 3,145 people lost their lives. Additionally, more than 21,000 people suffered some form of paralysis that ranged from mild paralysis to extreme cases where people became disabled. Dr. Jonas Salk is responsible for ending that plague. Born in New York City on October 28, 1914, Jonas Salk grew up in modest surroundings. His parents were not wealthy, but they were able to put food on the table and maintain a roof over their children's heads. Salk demonstrated great academic success from childhood. By the age of 13, he was enrolled into a school for gifted children. He was considered a perfectionist by his peers and succeeded academically in a very competitive environment. In college, Salk opted to go into medical school even though his mother wanted him to become an attorney. After graduating from medical school, Salk began his research on polio, which was considered a scourge of Western society. Polio had baffled medical science since its discovery in the mid-19th century. When Salk turned his attention to the disease, there was little hope that anyone could find an adequate cure. Salk developed his vaccine in the early 1950s, and in April of 1955, his accomplishment was heralded in the newspapers across the country. Salk became a national hero. His vaccine effectively ended the polio epidemic in the United States and many countries in the world. One of the greatest barriers in existence during the infancy of air travel was the speed of sound. It was considered impossible to build and fly an airplane that could exceed this speed. But that was before the world was introduced to Chuck Yeager. Yeager was an accomplished fighter pilot in World War II, But his greatest achievement was after the war, when he served as a test pilot for the United States Air Force. It was thought impossible to fly faster than sound during that period, and no one knew if a pilot could survive flying at that speed, or how it would affect him if he did survive. That did not deter Yeager, though. Yeager was born on February 13, 1923, in Myra, West Virginia. He served during World War II as a fighter pilot. He did not start out as a pilot, though. Yeager enlisted as a private who worked as an aircraft mechanic in the old Army Air Forces, where Yeager enrolled into a special program that trained enlisted men to become pilots. Yeager benefited greatly from having superior eyesight. He was considered a natural pilot early in his flight career. As a fighter pilot in the European theater, Yeager was shot down in France by German fighter planes. He avoided capture and helped a fellow pilot to safety after that pilot has lost his leg in the crash. Yeager was awarded a medal for his actions. He demonstrated exceptional talent as a pilot and once shot down 5 enemy fighters in a single day. After the war, Yeager began a new career as a test pilot, where he flew the experimental aircraft Bell X-1 into aviation history. On October 14, 1947, Yeager flew his X-1 faster than the speed of sound. He became the first human being to fly faster than sound, and he went on to break more records during his 60-year flight history. Yeager retired from the Army with the rank of Brigadier General, and has won many honors for his contributions to aviation. Steve Jobs was a self-made billionaire who brought personal computers into the homes of nearly every American in the country. He is credited with developing the technology that has personalized the computers. Jobs, along with his childhood friend Steve Wozniak, co-founded Apple Computers in 1976, working out of Jobs' garage. Jobs was born on February 24, 1955, to parents who gave him up for adoption shortly after birth. He was adopted by Clara and Paul Jobs. His father was a machinist who liked to spend time with his son taking electronic components apart and reassembling them. This is when and where Jobs developed his interest in mechanical reconstruction. Jobs was not the best student in high school. He was known as the class clown, although he was very intelligent. It was in high school that he met Wozniak. Both Jobs and Wozniak had great interest in electronics, and the pair was known for making computer technology smaller, cheaper, and more accessible to average persons. Jobs got his start working as a video game designer for the Atari Corporation. Once Jobs got Apple going, he sold his first computers, which were called the Apple I, for $666.66 each. The Apple I earned Jobs nearly $800,000 its first year, and that was just the beginning. The Apple II earned the fledgling company nearly $140 million, and by 1980, the company was worth $1.2 billion. Jobs branched out his financial kingdom, venturing into other businesses such as Pixar Animation Studios, which was also very successful. He briefly left Apple to found the Next Corporation, which produced both software and hardware, but Next floundered, and Jobs went back to Apple to develop iPhone and iPad. Jobs was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2003 and eventually lost his battle with cancer in October of 2011. One of the wealthiest women in the United States is Meg Whitman, Chief Executive Officer of Hewlett-Packard. Whitman is an Ivy League educated individual who is the 4th richest woman in the state of California and is listed number 20 on Forbes' list of wealthiest women in the United States. She is a graduate of Princeton University, where she earned her bachelor's degree in economics in 1977. After Princeton, Whitman earned her MBA at Harvard Business School in 1979. She originally wanted to study medicine, but changed majors early at Princeton. Whitman has found success wherever she has worked. She began her career working at Procter & Gamble before joining the Walt Disney Corporation, where she served as Vice President of Strategic Planning in 1989. She also worked for StrideRite and Hasbro corporations. Her biggest success was during a 10-year period working for eBay. When Whitman took eBay over in 1998, the online auction and retail business was doing approximately $4 million in sales annually. When she left the company in 2008, the business had grown to an $8 billion giant. eBay went from employing 30 employees in 1998 to employing more than 15,000 during her tenure as CEO at the company. Whitman won several awards for her work at eBay, and Forbes magazine placed her in the top 5 most powerful women in the country. Whitman is a moderate Republican who endorsed Mitt Romney's failed presidential campaign in 2008. She ran for governor of California in 2010, but lost to Jerry Brown. She hopes to run for president in the future and is listed as one of the most likely women to become president of the United States. The next time you decide to check your Facebook page to see if you have any new messages, likes, or just to see what your friends are up to, you can thank Mark Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg is the man that changed the way people keep in touch with each other. He literally changed the world. Born in White Plains, New York on May 14, 1984, Zuckerberg developed an interest in computer programming at an early age. When he was just 12 years old, he had developed a working messaging system that his father Edward used in his dental office. Zuckerberg had many friends who were artists, and they would come by and draw pictures for Mark. He would then design a computer game based on the characters drawn. In high school, Zuckerberg developed a music software program that drew interest from several large companies. He enrolled into Harvard University in 2002, where he developed his first social networking site for students only. The site was very popular, but it was shut down by the school for being inappropriate. During his sophomore year at Harvard, Zuckerberg began working on Facebook, a site that allowed its users to create a profile, share photos, and communicate with other members. He dropped out his sophomore year to dedicate his work to his site. He moved his operation to Palo Alto, California. By the end of 2004, Facebook had had more than 1 million members. Zuckerberg's rise to the top has not been without controversy. Some of his Harvard peers claimed that he stole their ideas and filed suit against Zuckerberg. The case was settled, but it continues to be an issue. Facebook generates more than $1.5 billion in net revenues today.